Hello, everybody. Welcome to the May 30th instance occurrence of the Kubernetes Gateway API Gamma meeting. Quick reminder that this meeting is governed by the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, so please be kind and respectful to everybody. Hopefully not just within these meetings, but especially within these meetings. We have an open agenda that I will post in the chat. So please, on that agenda, feel free to put your any topics that you want to discuss there, and we ask that you, if you can, put your name and affiliation in the attendance section, just so we can have a record and know who is attending these things. I'm gonna actually change the order of the agenda just a bit, just because I think this we've got a quick PSA, and I'll also share my screen so people can see the agenda. That'd be nice. And I'll zoom in to the agenda a good bit. Is that decent size for everybody?
Works for me.
It'd make the window a lot narrower. It'd probably be easier for folks on smaller screens.
I'll try that. Oh, now I got to zoom out because the window is
Maybe
narrow.
not that narrow.
Yeah, maybe more like square. Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. Cool.
Better. Cool. All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started on our topics. Quick PSA from the regular Gateway API meeting, which is this morning. Still wrapping my head around that, it's weird to say. But we are, there's a change coming to the storage and served API versions that will require some changes to applicate to most implementations in 080. Rob, do you want to jump in and give any more context here?
Yeah, sure. This is something that I think should be unexpected, should be expected, I should say. We've been working towards this for a minute. What this means is if you're using gateway class, or HTTP route, and you happen to be interacting with that with v1 alpha 2, you used to get just a deprecation warning that said, hey, this API version is deprecated, upgrade to v1 beta 1. Now you just will get an error. It means that although we will continue to have the API version present in the CRD, it's not going to be served, which means it's not going to be accessible. Based on the PR, it seems like most implementations out there have already upgraded to use v1 beta 1. But if you haven't, make sure you do before 080, because this is on pace to get in 080. So yeah, just take a look. There's some guidance as far as what changes you should be looking to make if you haven't already. Yeah, that's coming. I haven't seen anyone who is affected by this yet, or at least has commented on here, but please let us know if you will be.
Right on. Appreciate it.
That looks pretty straightforward.
Yep, just wanted to be complete and making sure as many folks get access to this as possible. All right then, Flynn, the floor is yours.
So as of last week, I feel like the last time we were talking about the interaction of gateways and service meshes when they are both trying to do gamma things. The short version was the proposal that I've just listed in the TLDR there, that gateways must default to routing directly to workload endpoints, but may offer the ability to route to service cluster IPs if they want. The last time we talked about this one, Mike and I said that we wanted to pull that out of the requirements for the next gamma milestone, which was done. And we also said we'd pretty much come to a consensus, but there was a lot of wordsmithing still to be done. A fair amount of that wordsmithing is now in suggestions in the document, and hopefully will be, actually properly in the document, at which point I expect we will turn it into an actual GEP document fairly shortly after that. And yeah, that's about it. Oh, how nice. It shows up in magenta on your screen and green in mine.
So I have not followed this as closely as I would like. I know we discussed this last week.
There should not be anything in there that's a surprise to you, Rob.
Okay, that's great to hear. The one thing, like I'm just glancing at this, one of the things that stated is the gateway and mesh must work together. And you probably do go into that in more detail in the doc itself, but can you give like a 30-second high level?
The main impact
Summary.
of saying that the gateway must do endpoint routing is that the service mesh is largely cut out of that first hop between the gateway and the first meshed workload. And so that is mostly just a description of the fact that from the perspective of the users of these things, rather than just going, oh, I want to do all of this in the mesh, then they will end up needing to rely on the gateway for part of it and the mesh for a different part of it. And we should recognize that. There's not a lot that's dramatic in that section about changes that I think we need to make. That's mostly just calling out a thing that I think is an implication of doing things that way.
Okay, yeah, I got it.
Yeah.
So what this is really describing is not so much where you were going earlier, which was, the cluster IP type routing. This is more just saying we need to, at a high level, have a plan and understanding for how implementations of gateway can interact with implementations of mesh, and what we can recommend users do. Okay. All right.
Yep.
Cool. Thanks. Does this actually make recommendations at this point, or is it primarily just kind of a problem statement, like that initial?
There are a couple of recommendations in there that mostly boil down to things should work if you specify multiple parent refs on an HTTP route, and one of them is a gateway and one of them is a mesh, and things like that.
Okay.
Again, I don't think, based on the last conversations that we've had, I don't think there's anything that you're going to find surprising. I think everybody ought to read it once. We'll keep updating things, and hopefully it won't be anything too terribly surprising to anybody else after last week either.
Great.
I had to find the unmute button. Cool. I'll take a look at this, skimming through. Nothing looks too objectionable, but I'll take a second look. Okay, so any other questions or things to discuss on this topic? It's the good question, John. It is actually the original doc from October that is being edited. I looked around for it a couple of times myself. Oh, okay. And as soon as I say that, he found it. Classic John. All right. Great. All right. My topic was kind of similar to that one in that our milestone is clear, which is exciting.
Yay.
Got Shane to move it. So at this point, we're effectively saying that, and we already did officially say it via this implementable PR, but there are no issues here. I want us to start thinking about 080, and got this note here is that we still need to make website changes for Gamma. And this kind of final call to see if there's anything left that we feel needs to be in that 080 release for Gamma. Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, no, this is great. What I would say is if our milestone is clear, that milestone was for implementable, is that correct? Okay.
Yeah,
Right. So we probably need a corresponding milestone or something for experimental 080, whatever we want to call it, for Gamma specifically. And maybe we can track some of these things like the documentation updates, the API spec updates, just so we make sure, we're I think 4 weeks away from when we said we were going to aim for 080, like it's pretty soon. So I want to make sure that we are on track and not, not missing things. And the other thing is this is me from the outside looking in. I did notice there's a couple Gamma related PRs open right now. One is clarifying a gap, and the other is new conformance tests. Both just have Gamma in the title. I don't know if there's but anyways, I'm not sure if those are meant to fit before 080. I feel like the first one by John probably should. I don't know about the second one. But if those are also intended in scope for this milestone, we should make sure they get added in track somewhere.
To that milestone, yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Shane, sorry.
I was just gonna say, if there's a couple things left to do for that milestone, let's add them to that milestone. Otherwise, I can close the milestone, but it sounds like
Yeah,
we
no,
want
it's
essentially add those in here.
no, it sounds like this is. I don't know. I don't know what we were aiming for here. I think our interpretation of this was this is implementable. And maybe what we're aiming for the 080 is very slightly different than that. It's the experimental level, which means it's actually part of the API release in 080.
We should talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, right. I don't know if we want that to be the same milestone, like just reuse that same milestone, or if we want to create a new one.
I assume that, Keith, you want me to close this one and we celebrate with drinks.
I don't drink, but I'll take a can of Sprite. Right.
That's all I got actually right now. So it's Sprite 0. I hope that's okay.
I think that I'm glad about this up because let's talk about where we are in relation to where we thought we were going to be. So I remember when we started create this milestone, the goal was just to get something out there for people to play with, and I think we probably overshot that goal a bit. A lot of the last conversations that we had when it comes to Gamma and getting to implementable, we're kind of past that trying phase, and so I think we're probably there. But when it comes to, as Rob's mentioning, API review, getting things on the website, that feels like another bar. And so I'm a big fan of celebrating wins. I think we're all friends of celebrating wins. So personally, no, I think it would feel good and even send a signal community-wise to close this milestone and open up a new one. And then use that new one to track progress towards 080. Not sure what how others feel about that. Go ahead, Shane.
Yeah, so it took us a while to get here and we should celebrate, no joke. I think that closing this milestone and saying, hey, we reached a milestone, an important milestone, is good. I take a lot of pause with doing this long walk to implementable and then a short walk to experimental. Part of that is influenced by the pain we are currently seeing with the policy attachment and meta resources GEP, which has been an experimental for 2 years, so experimental has lost its meaning. It's in production. And there's pain that we're going to pay, somebody's going to pay for that one way or another. So I would be more cautious about calling it experimental, because experimental for us doesn't mean what I think it should. It's just the nature of the beast. That's just what it is. I can't change that right now. But I do want to see us come up with another important milestone that doesn't make people feel like there's a long slog ahead either. So some sort of balance between the two sounds good to me. Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, so I think, again, my opinion's biased here, but experimental
let's face it.
Yeah, it's fair. Experimental, as the name suggests, is pretty clear in its meaning. I think the problem is whatever you call something, if it is accessible to users and widely implemented for some period of time, it becomes really painful to change that. It doesn't really matter what you call it. It's just, if it's implemented widely, we already are at that stage. And then if it's, officially recognized by the API, even as something like experimental, but if there's docs there that state that, which we're almost there already, just via GEPS. I don't know, I think, in my opinion, I think one of the lessons we learned with policy, and I agree, it sat in experimental for a very long time. And just kind of, variety of things. But what I would say is we should aim to move more quickly, but not calling something experimental, even though it meets all the criteria, feels unfortunate. It feels like the thing we should be trying to fix is moving faster from experimental to standard, to like, this is a thing we want to move for, or iterating more quickly. But what we need to avoid is just sitting on something that people are uncomfortable with and not changing it and seeing it get widely implemented.
So you're saying we're kind of in a position where momentum will just win out?
Yeah, I mean,
The iterating more quickly part actually resonated quite a bit with me, right? Rather than just sitting on something when we know that people are uncomfortable with it. Rob, it almost kind of sounds like what you're saying is that we should make a point of changing all the experimental APIs every month or so, just so people don't get too comfortable with them and they constantly recognize that there will be change and don't lock themselves into it, which, I'm deliberately being kind of facetious there, but it really does make me wonder what sorts of things we could do to try to make it less likely that things that are experimental don't gain the excess pain of people trying to actually use them in production. It's also tricky in that we need people to try things to get feedback, but we don't want them to, we don't want to burn them when we change things based on the feedback, right? So
that's why, to be clear, I was not suggesting that we absolutely do not call it experimental, but some kind of a balanced approach, because this whole situation has proven time and time again to be a knife's edge, and we have to walk it somehow.
Well, that or we all give up and go back to farming, right?
I mean, yeah.
What if we just call it the milestone 080 and not assign other semantic meaning to where we get, like, we've got the PR calling it implementable. What if for tracking we just use 080?
That sounds fine. I mean, we were kind of thinking 080 would be your milestone in a way. Like, there would potentially be some other things that come along for the ride, but it would mostly be a gamma related milestone. But I want to reiterate, I'm not saying don't call it experimental necessarily. I'm not trying to make a hard and fast, like, stop, don't call it experimental. I'm pointing out some of the pains that we've had with such a thing, that we don't really know the future well enough to know how far we're going to get into experimental, and that there may become a point where we pay hefty prices for implementations that are out in the wild on experimental when we decide that there are some things that we want to do. For instance, sorry if you're hearing my kid in the background, by the way. For instance,
clearly your kid is very upset about this experimental business.
He's not liking it. He's like, Dad, what? No. Cal and Tim have repeatedly mentioned potential issues with the whole attaching to a service business, right? To go experimental and then go into production without even having resolved that, and then potentially getting to a point where it's like, ooh, we really, really didn't want to do that, could be painful, very painful, right? That's kind of more my point than trying to say do this or do that. It's more think about these things. It's not I don't think it's a cut and dry decision what we do moving forward.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, I agree that we should be cautious. I should clarify, at least from my perspective, what the difference is between implementable and experimental. From my perspective, implementable has been used to indicate that this is something implementation should go out and build upon. But implementable, in my opinion, has not been meant to be a long-term state. This is a thing to act upon, but then we're going to release something. And when we release something, we're going to call it experimental. In the case of Gamma, it's a little funny because it's not like we're releasing a new API field, resource, anything like that. We're just likely just updating our docs and changing the API spec to say, with Gamma, this is what a parent ref could look like. It's pretty minimal changes all the way around. We're really just saying, this is formally something that we're releasing, which that if we were not to graduate this to experimental, I think it would be unfortunate in the sense that I think implementable generally indicates this is a thing we're intending to release, go implement it. If we move to implementable without an intention of getting to experimental with the same thing, that would be unfortunate in my opinion.
And unfair, but
Yeah.
also what kind of time frame are we talking about? Like, are we literally talking about going straight to experimental stage in a month? It's pretty fast.
It is, but we already have 3 implementations, if my math is correct. So we already have the implementable bit addressed, in my opinion.
We also have conformance tests as well. Like we're starting to, I think we've got most of the criteria, not all the criteria.
Yeah, I have appetite for changing experimental, but I don't want to do that as like a yoink underneath Gamma either. So, because that would not be nice. But I really do have a lot of appetite.
Kind of depends. In what manner would you be thinking of changing experimental, right?
Actually, I was thinking we just remove it and send it straight to GA. Let's do that in 4 weeks. It's done. Let's do it. Everybody wants to do it. Let's just do it. No, I'm messing. But I talked with Nick and Rob about this at some point. So don't take this with a grain of salt or whatever. But I kind of like the idea that experimental comes with like a timing check-in, where we basically default to declining things if they can't be resolved past experimental after a certain time. I don't know if that'll be a problem with Gamma, all things considered. I do wonder though, if we call it experimental in 4 weeks, if that will be driving way out ahead and kind of pulling everybody along and getting us really far and getting us into production. And then we come back and there's a lot of questions still left to answer. I don't know. I don't want to hold this whole thing up. I mean, I know it's just like 7 of us or, oh, it's 9 of us now, but I don't want to hold this whole thing up on my caution, but I did want to express that caution. And I'm open to what we do about it. I appreciate that you're listening to it.
My own take here is that I'll agree with you. I think we should have similar guardrails to what exists in upstream Kubernetes, which is that when something is experimental or in Kubernetes in a non-GA state, there are guardrails where within N releases, this needs to graduate to the next level, or we're just going to drop it, roughly. And that seems like a reasonable idea to force things along, or just not have in Kubernetes, it was avoid perma beta. I guess for us, perma experimental, whatever that is, we need to have some mechanism there. The other thing I wanted to say just briefly is that implementable is something that happened maybe a little later than it should have. Like people, by the time we marked this as implementable on Gamma, it had already been implemented. It was more of a formality. It's not like, people have been working on Gamma for nearly a year now, maybe long. I don't know. Others are more familiar with
a little over a year.
Yeah.
So just under a year. Yeah.
Wasn't it?
To me,
March?
I feel like we're not rushing something if it's been kind of soaking for a year and now is implemented. And, I feel like it's anything less than pushing this through to experimental is just kind of, again, artificially underselling the state of this API.
Yeah, maybe
there is an interesting question that comes up there, which was something that Shane alluded to. So we go ahead, we mark it as experimental. People start building on it. 6 months from now, everybody and their brother is going through and binding HTTP routes to services. And right about this time is when the upstream folks with Kubernetes itself come back and go, you know what? We figured out all the reasons why this truly is a terrible, terrible thing, and we need to cut this out. So is it worth considering that kind of a future and figuring out how do we, how we would get out of that particular corner? And
Do we-
yeah, I am kind of thinking about the policy attachment scenario here too, right? Where we have people at this point, obviously I'm biased, coming in to say, hey, there are problems here. And one of the bits of pushback we get is along the lines of, well, people are already using it, So that question about, is this something we pay for now or is it something we pay for later, is an interesting question to me. And I am also not particularly trying to argue that we shouldn't say experimental right now. I am saying this seems like something we might want to think about a bit. Sorry, go ahead, Rob.
Sorry, I've probably been monopolizing conversation here, but one thing I'd say is upstream Kubernetes moves pretty slowly. So saying anything significant is going to change in 6 months is hopeful, but
The best case scenario? Wouldn't it be worse if they come back in 18 months instead of 6?
Sure. But what I'll also say is we've tried to be as inclusive as possible in SIGNet leadership, in making sure that upstream SIG network leaders are reviewing every release. And what it means to graduate to experimental is that Gamma would be in scope and would need to be approved by, so far it's been mostly Tim and Cal, but anyone at SIG network leadership level is welcome in part of that review process. But generally, I trust them to not say, oh yeah, this is fine, and then turn around and completely, break things on us. They are pretty good at having a good long-term picture and vision in mind when they're reviewing things. So I get the concern, but I think at some point, just have to admit that we've made it to a point that even if it,
I don't want to move the cheese right as we're getting to it. But again, I just want to make that abundantly clear because I think I came off a little harder than I intended originally, but I don't want to string us along.
But I do think that, Rob, your point about the idea that SIG network would be looking at that and trying to think ahead actually really does do, that goes a long way towards addressing that particular concern. So that's a good thing to hear that feedback on. Sorry, Louis, you were going to say?
Yeah, I guess there's a set of these kind of long-term alignment issues, right? That there are hand-wavy concerns about, right? Like the policy attachment to service stuff. Rob, correct me if I'm wrong, but Tim's opinion is this is bad, but there's nothing better.
Yeah,
right?
that's
the nothing better part. To fix that part requires changes to services itself, right? Right, the disaggregation of the concepts of service into different API resources. And 18 months would be an optimistic timeline projection for that getting into Kubernetes at best, because it's so freaking fundamental, right? Like maybe, right, if SIG network put 60% of its meeting effort into that for the next 6 months, right, that might make some progress. But I haven't been to a SIG network meeting in a while, or the SIG gateway meeting in a while, but
it doesn't come up.
Yeah,
it's
okay.
It's not going to come up. So I'm kind of excluded from the group because I have a bias, but I know that Tim and Cal basically aren't. This isn't on their regular agenda.
Okay, so
it will become on their agenda when we push it on their agenda, kind of situation. So 6 months isn't a matter of when they're going to come to us. 6 months is a matter of will we go to them? How soon will we go to them next? So I don't know. I think
Right, and
Flynn's point still stands under that criteria, but at the same time, I get what you're saying. You're saying, I mean, it's not like we're getting prescriptive feedback. So
Right.
what can we do in that situation, in a non-prescriptive feedback situation? We can try to find an alternative or continue with what we got. I think my pause comes mainly from the fact that I'm pretty sure we're going to continue with what we've got. And I'm worried about the knife's edge of that experiment ending up in production, where we get to the point where we finally realize, oh, this has some significant drawbacks in production. That's my pause.
so I guess there's another question, like who bears the risk, right? Of the drawbacks.
Customers.
Yes.
The users,
And
unfortunately, yeah.
their choices of mesh implementation, right? Primarily, not necessarily Kubernetes itself.
Go on.
Well,
Wait.
let's say in this wonderful future, right, where there's a choice, right, that there is a refactoring of service and its component constituent parts, right, and then there's a clear point at which a policy should be attached to either the front end or back end side of service, and there is prescriptive guidance about how that composition should be achieved for everything in networking, right, not just mesh. Then service mesh customers which have absorbed the policy attachment to service part would still be in this situation where they have to absorb the service refactoring, right, over the course of the deprecation of that API, which I'm going to guess is measured in years. So even if there's a definition of that and a deprecation of it, the support window for the customer is still probably somewhere in the 2 to 4 year time range, if we were to ever deprecate it.
So is it that you're advocating that we just
Happen to ever move?
Keith?
Sorry, there was
Switching?
a little glitch. Keith had to drop. He had something come up, and
Okay.
so I'm host and had to restart recording. Anyway, carry on.
Yeah. So, right, which of these types of events or edge triggers are we going to consider reasonable to attach experimental to? Right, because those, right, the compositional parts of the API, right, we have rough timelines in our heads for when we think any of those things can happen. Now, a different choice that we make in this group, when service is refactored and when the refactoring of service goes live in the API, the last two being very far out.
Yeah, the last two definitely don't seem like triggers we should be waiting for. Triggers that we should maybe think about a little bit. Yeah, sure. But honestly, this level of thinking about it is sufficient for my concerns. I think it really would be interesting to try to figure out if there are ways that we can do things to try to make it less likely for experimental things to end up in production before we, find some of these issues. But I'm not so far sure of what sorts of things we could do about that.
Yeah, this is the age-old problem of every Kubernetes API ever. It is not
every
unique.
API ever, right?
Yeah.
Kubernetes or not.
You want
It's
feedback.
Yes.
Yeah,
It's never into
exactly.
production until it's completely in production, at which point it's stable, even though it's experimental.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, we could, change all the version numbers in some magic field every month, then nobody would use it at all, but that would prevent it from going into production. Great. Yeah.
Well, I think there are some philosophical questions that don't need to be stated here, but I think that there is very little appetite that I've heard for anything other than full steam ahead. So thank you for hearing me out. I don't want to capitalize on any more of this time.
Well, I think the one thing I could ask, right, because we did go through a filtration process to get to this proposal in the first place, right? Of the available options. Have new options come into the collective zeitgeist that we should consider?
I should probably point out that, just to be 100% certain that we're talking about the same thing, when I brought up attaching stuff to services, I was specifically thinking of binding an HTTP route via its parent ref to a service, as
Yes.
opposed to policy attachment being, attaching a policy using a policy attachment mechanism from GEP 713 to a service. I'm quite certain that associating an HTTP route to a service is a thing that needs to be supported right now, and I'm also quite certain that it will be insufficient in the future. But that particular comment about, oh, if Tim or somebody comes up and hates the idea of, of services, was referencing Shane's comment of, yeah, we know that some of the SIG network people are not terribly happy with binding routes to services. I don't think there's any great new alternatives to that right now for the mesh case.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like the direction we're heading on, at least for the scope of Gamma as it exists today, is both not ideal, but also there is no better alternative that will exist in the next 2 years, probably. That, and so we should do something within the limitations we have. That does not mean that we can't improve upon that in the future.
And for the record, that timeline makes me very sad, but I believe it.
Yeah, there, if you think that Gateway API is understaffed, which I will always say it is, we usually get more attendees and interest and motivation at Gateway API meetings than we do at SIG Network meetings. And SIG Network is much broader in scope than Gateway. So it's just, there's just not enough people.
Way to make me feel guilty for not showing up for SIG Network, Rob. Appreciate that.
Working on it. No. Yeah. Okay, so I think we know what's next. It seems like at a high level, what we should work on in the next few weeks is adding things to the 0.8 milestone, making sure they have a mesh label associated with them, and running with that for tracking 0.80. I think we're in the ballpark of 4 to 6 weeks away from that. I would love to make it on the lower end of that, because once we as a project are ready, we still need to turn around and take that to Tim and Cal and whoever else at SIG Network level to review it. So it's going to take some time. Yeah, that's what I think is our next steps. And I just want to make sure that we're on track for that. And we can continue all these discussions kind of in parallel. And like I think Shane and Flynn have both said, we probably need some refinement at minimum on what we consider experimental versus implementable, different stages of this journey. Yeah.
So again, maybe not right as Gamma is trying to hit it, because that would kind of mean so.
It is
a lesson we keep learning, though.
I've had a while where I keep on thinking, oh man, I want to improve, this process or policy or whatever, but I don't want it to target, these existing gaps. And so I don't really know how to do that, because there's never a right moment, because there's always some gap or some gaps that are in flight. But at some point, we do need to make some improvements there.
We could probably start talking about it and explicitly grandfather in gaps that were already open at the beginning of the discussion.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
As a potential mechanism. Rob, do you want to, that is your screen, right? You want to scroll up a little bit so that people can, sorry, other direction. There we go. Do people agree with that summary of everything that we just said, or shall I go ahead and edit that further?
Yep, from me.
Yeah, that looks good. And thank you. I never know who's the one taking notes, but thank you. So
I'm not.
I could
sure
tell it
where-
was Flynn because he managed to key in the TM and nobody else would have been able to do that.
Dude,
impressive.
it's just option 2 on a Mac.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
Okay.
It
Cool.
looks really
All right.
strange in some fonts, but this is one area where Google Docs actually tends to do the same thing. One of the
Nice.
few.
Cool. All right. Well, I think that wraps up our meeting for today, unless anyone had any last thoughts. Great. Well, thanks everyone. Good discussion, and we'll talk to
Thanks
everyone
much.
next week. All right. See you.